Close your eyes for a moment. Before you open them, breathe in. That is not the smell of oil and exhaust you might expect from a city that will one day call itself the Motor City. Not yet. What you smell right now, standing on the banks of the Detroit River in the spring of 1893, is something older and more primal. It is the sharp, acrid bite of coal smoke pouring from 1,000 factory chimneys. It is the sweet, sickly rot of river mud churned up by the paddle wheels of steamers heading east toward Lake Erie. And underneath all of it, threading through everything like a signature, is the hot metallic breath of iron being melted, poured, and hammered into shape. You are standing in the stove capital of the world. That is not a nickname anyone is being modest about. Detroit in 1893 produces more cast iron stoves than any city on earth. The Michigan Stove Company alone consumes 65 tons of iron every single day. Every morning, the sky above the eastern flats turns a particular shade of orange-gray that workers have learned to read like a weather forecast. If the smoke is thick and the hammering starts before sunrise, it means orders are up. It means rent gets paid. It means the city is still alive. And right now, Detroit believes it will be alive forever. Woodward Avenue is electric, literally. Just this year, the city replaced its horse-drawn streetcars with electric trams, one of the first systems of its kind in America. The cars hiss and spark as they roll north past the storefronts. Men in derby hats step off the curb to let them pass, and children chase the copper wires overhead with their eyes, like they are watching something miraculous. A city that just years ago moved at the speed of a horse, now moves at the speed of a current. But there is something else in the air this morning, something that does not quite smell like progress. It is thinner than smoke, and harder to name. It is the specific tension of a city that has borrowed against its own future. And somewhere, deep in the machinery of American finance, the first bolts are beginning to loosen. Walk north on Woodward and the city opens up like a theater. The buildings here are not frontier buildings. They are statements. The Hammond Building, completed just 4 years ago, rises 10 stories above Campus Martius, Detroit's first true skyscraper, its Romanesque arches stacked in dark red brick as if daring the sky to push back. Architects in Boston and Chicago are drawing plans for towers twice that height. But in Detroit in 1893, 10 stories is still enough to make a man tilt his head back and feel small. This is the geography of confidence. On Jefferson Avenue, the mansions of the copper and railroad aristocracy stand shoulder to shoulder behind iron fences. Inside those houses, the libraries have Persian rugs, the dining rooms have gas chandeliers, and the cellars have French wine brought up the St. Lawrence by merchant ships. These are the men who finance the foundries. They do not work in them. They have never smelled the orange smoke. On a side street off Gratiot, a man named Andrei Kowalski is walking to his shift at the Detroit Stove Works. He came from Poznan, Poland 2 years ago, with $7 and the address of a cousin in Poletown. He works 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and earns $1.50 per shift. He sends half of that to his mother in Europe. The other half goes to the boarding house on St. Aubin Street, where he shares a room with 3 other men. He does not own a derby hat. He owns a cap and a pair of boots he resold himself. But Andre believes, with the deep and irrational certainty of the newly arrived, that Detroit will reward him eventually. That the city is a machine he has finally gotten himself inside. At the corner of Woodward and Adams, workmen are laying the foundation for Joseph Hudson's new department store, the most ambitious retail project in the city's history. Hudson has bet everything on Detroit's continued rise. The foundation alone took 3 months to dig through the clay. Inside, there will be carpeted floors and an elevator. Women with parasols will ride it up and down for the pleasure of it. Standing here, watching the city build itself in real time, it is almost impossible to imagine that in exactly 6 weeks, the entire financial scaffolding holding all of this upright will begin to collapse. Turn left off Woodward, walk 4 blocks east, and the city changes its face entirely. The mansions are gone. The electric trams do not run here. The streets are unpaved, and in the spring thaw they turn into channels of brown mud that swallow boots to the ankle. This is where the city actually lives. Corktown, Poletown, the tangled grid of worker neighborhoods that press up against the factory walls like a crowd against a gate. In these blocks, a family of 7 might share 2 rooms in a wooden tenement, where the walls sweat in winter and the floors buckle in summer. The privies are shared between 4 families and drain into a trench behind the building. The water comes from a common pump 3 doors down. Tuberculosis moves through these streets quietly, the way water moves through a crack, slowly, and then all at once. In 1893, the infant mortality rate in Detroit's poorest wards is nearly 3 times that of the wealthier districts to the north. But here is what the copper merchants on Jefferson Avenue do not want to think about. What the financial pages of the Detroit Free Press do not want to print. The boom itself is built on paper. The railroads that carried Detroit stoves to the continent, the same railroads whose stocks are traded furiously on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, are not nearly as profitable as their share prices suggest. They have been capitalized by speculators who borrowed money to buy stocks whose value was inflated by other speculators, who had also borrowed. Every layer of the structure depends on the layer beneath it being solid. None of them are. In England, the great banking house of Baring Brothers collapsed 3 years ago after overinvesting in Argentina, sending a tremor through global credit markets that most American businessmen convinced themselves they had survived. They had not survived it. They had merely delayed it. By the spring of 1893, the United States Treasury's gold reserves are dropping toward levels that financial men speak about only in whispers. The music has not stopped yet, but the band is getting tired. May 5, 1893, New York. The National Cordage Company, one of the most heavily traded stocks on Wall Street, declares bankruptcy. In a single day, the Dow loses nearly 1/4 of its value. Within weeks, the panic spreads outward from New York like a crack moving through ice, and Detroit feels it the way a body feels a fever. Slowly at first, then overwhelmingly. Banks stop lending. Orders for stoves collapse. The Detroit Stove Works cuts its shifts. The Michigan Stove Company lays off 400 men in a single week. By autumn, the unemployment rate in Detroit is approaching 30%. In some of the immigrant wards, it is closer to half. Andrei Kowalski, who believed in the machine of the city, is standing outside his factory at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, holding a slip of paper that says his services are no longer required. He has $11 saved. The boarding house costs $2 a week. That winter, men gather outside the Board of Public Works building on a cold, gray morning, and the shout that rises from the crowd is not complicated. It is 3 words, and it is a threat: bread or blood. The mayor of Detroit is a man named Hazen Pingree. He is not a politician by training. He is a shoemaker, the 2nd largest shoe manufacturer in America, who got elected by promising to break the stranglehold that transit and utility monopolies had on the working class. He is not an idealist. He is a pragmatist who grew up poor in Maine and understands, in his body rather than his mind, what it means to have nothing. Pingree looks at the city, the vacant lots, the frozen men, the children eating bread made from sawdust flour, and he makes a decision that will be mocked in every newspaper in Michigan. He will give the unemployed land. City land, church land, private land donated or borrowed. He will give them seeds and tools and printed instructions in Polish and Hungarian and German. He will let them feed themselves. To raise the first funds, Pingree sells his own prize horse, an animal he paid $1,300 for, at a public auction. It goes for $387. He hands the money to his agricultural committee without blinking. The newspapers call him Potato Patch Pingree. A pastor at a wealthy congregation jokes from the pulpit that the congregation should pray for the potatoes to grow as fast as the mayor's head. So no child in Detroit goes hungry, the joke earning precisely the laughter it deserves from people who have never been hungry. But in the spring of 1894, 3,000 families apply for plots. 945 receive them, half an acre each. By harvest, those families produce $14,000 worth of food from ground that was weeds 6 months before. The city did not collapse. It planted itself back into the earth and waited. In Grand Circus Park today, there is a bronze statue of Hazen Pingree. The inscription calls him the idol of the people. More than 5,000 individual donations from working-class Detroiters funded that monument after his death in 1901. Men and women who had planted on his patches and survived a winter that should have broken them. But the full weight of what happened in Detroit in 1893 and 1894 only becomes visible when you pull back and look at what came after. Within 3 years of the panic, a mechanic named Charles Brady King drove the first gasoline-powered automobile through the streets of Detroit in March of 1896. Crowds lining Woodward to watch something none of them had a name for yet. 7 years after that, Henry Ford incorporated the Ford Motor Company. The stove capital became the Motor City not despite the collapse, but in some complicated way because of it. The panic cleared out the weak companies, broke the speculative bubbles, and left behind a city of workers who had learned to adapt to the impossible. The potato patches were copied by New York, Boston, Chicago, Minneapolis, Denver, and Seattle within 2 years. Decades later, when the United States entered 2 world wars, federal officials looking for a model for urban food production programs found Pingree's experiment waiting in the archives. The victory gardens that fed millions during World War II grew in the soil that Pingree first turned over in a Detroit winter. The street where Andrei Kowalski once walked to his shift at the stoveworks is now part of the Eastern Market District, one of the oldest continuously operating farmers markets in America, where every Saturday morning people drive from the suburbs to buy vegetables from the same ground that once fed the unemployed. Detroit in 1893 is not a story about a city that nearly fell. It is a story about what a city decides to do with the knowledge that it is not invincible. Every city carries that knowledge somewhere, buried under the confidence, under the new construction, under the electric trams and the rising skylines. The question that Detroit could not answer in the spring of 1893, and that no city has fully answered since, is this: when the system that built you turns on you, what do you still own? What can you grow from the ground you are standing on? And is that enough? If you could step back into Detroit in that moment, not into a Gilded Age mansion on Jefferson Avenue, but into a half-acre plot in the frozen city, holding a packet of seeds and a printed sheet of instructions in a language you barely read, would you believe it was enough? Tell us in the comments, and tell us which city you want us to rebuild next.